Before we get started setting up our free tier account on AWS, which is what we're going to do in the next lesson, I just wanted to talk a bit about how pricing works on AWS. So there are three fundamentals of pricing on AWS. The first is you've got your compute. So you get charged for the amount of resources you use and the amount of time that you use them. So as an example, if you're running a virtual server instance on Amazon EC2, you pay for the amount of CPU and memory that you allocate and the amount of hard drive space you allocate. And then you pay that rate for however long you're actually using that instance. And that's one of the main ways of paying. Now there's a couple of other nuances to that which I'll talk about in a moment. So firstly, there's compute, so you're paying for the amount of resources that you use and the amount of time. So there's a rate and there's the amount of time that you use them. For storage, you're generally paying for the amount of data that you're storing. So it's the actual quantity of data stored. In some cases, it's the actual amount of space you've allocated to store data on as well. And that's something which we'll cover in more detail in a couple of sections' time. The third fundamental of AWS pricing is data that is sent outbound. So let's say that you upload data to AWS. You might have a large volume of data and you upload that data to AWS. Maybe you put it in the Amazon S3 service, which is the object storage system on AWS. Now, you don't pay for uploading your data to AWS. There's no charge. That's inbound data. But when you then decide that you need to pull that data back down again, maybe it's backup data and you need to restore it, at that point you pay for the traffic that goes outbound. So you pay for outbound data transfer, and there's a certain rate up to a certain quantity of data that you pay, and then the rate might change a bit. So you've got to look at what the total aggregate is of data that you're sending outbound from all your services to be able to work out how much you're going to pay. So let's have a quick look on the AWS website to get a bit more detail on pricing. So this is the main AWS pricing page. If you just Google AWS pricing, this is what you're going to find. And I'll put the links, by the way, into the lessons so that you can actually access these materials directly as well. So AWS mentioned here that there are different ways that you can pay for AWS. So firstly, you have pay as you go. So this is what we would normally associate with cloud computing, where you're actually paying a rate for the amount of time that you use a resource. So if you start a virtual server and you use it for 12 hours, you get charged for 12 hours usage. Another thing that you can do though is you can save money when you reserve. So in this case, it's no longer an on-demand or a pay-as-you-go consumption model. It's more like you have a contract. So you say, well, I'm going to commit to running an Amazon EC2 instance for 1 year or 3 years. And because I contract to do so, I'm going to pay for that whole term, but I'll get a massive discount. And as you can see here, you can get up to 75% discount. So if you know that your workload, your application is going to run for a certain period of time, at least 1 year, for example, it might be better to actually reserve some capacity and get a big discount. Another attribute of pricing on AWS is that you can pay less by using more. So as you use more, for example, as you store more data, you'll find that you reach a threshold and then the rate of storing additional data gets lower. So you can achieve lower costs for certain services if you use more of them. If we scroll down a bit further, we've got a series of categories here, and then you can drill into these to find more information. So for example, we could go to compute, Amazon EC2, and then we've got the page here. Now, free tier is really interesting. That's what we're going to be using in this course, where you actually get 750 hours of a certain instance type, what we call a T2 micro, each month for 1 year. So that's a full year of being able to use a Linux or Windows instance, which is pretty cool. And you then have a couple of other options. So you've got the on-demand, which is what I mentioned before, where it's just a consumption model. You choose to launch an instance and you pay for however long you use that instance. And of course, you pay different amounts depending on how much CPU and RAM and so on that you've allocated. Now, there's something else called a spot instance. And what this is where the unused capacity on AWS is offered to you at a really low price. And so as long as your workload's flexible, because when AWS need the capacity back again, they can take it and shut down your application. But it can be a way to get some really cheap compute time. We then have a couple of options for reserving capacity. So you've got the reserved instances, which is what I was talking about a bit earlier, where you can save money by committing to a term. And then you have what's called a savings plan, which is a kind of variation of that, in which you can commit to a certain amount of usage, not specifically a certain amount of time. So you might have a certain amount of hours per day rather than just using it 24 hours a day for a year. So these are options where you can pay in a slightly different model to the consumption model. And then there's other services where you might pay differently as well, such as dedicated hosts. So normally AWS is multi-tenant, so your Amazon EC2 instances would be running on the same hardware as other customers. And it does impose some issues as well with not having visibility into what resources underlying the actual virtual instance are being used. Around licensing, that can be an issue sometimes. So with server-bound licenses, for instance, sometimes you need to be able to say, well, my instance is running on some hardware with a certain amount of CPU power. Otherwise, you might pay a higher licensing cost. So that's called a dedicated host, and you'll pay considerably more for using dedicated hosts. So if we go back up and look at storage, again, we've got quite a few different storage services here. Let's have a look at Amazon S3. And here we can see that you pay for the amount of storage that you store. So for the first 50 terabytes, you pay this rate. And then for the next 450, you pay a slightly lower rate. And then it gets a bit better again over 500 terabytes. You can also change the region, so you can see different pricing depending on where you are in the world. You also pay other additional costs for things like requests and data retrievals, data transfer, and management and replication. So there is a bit more to the pricing on AWS, but all the information is there. So whatever service it is you're looking to run, I suggest you just have a look through the AWS website and you should be able to find that information. And another tool that you might want to look at is the AWS calculator. So let's just search for calculator AWS, and there it is. So the URL is literally just calculator.aws. So let's open this up. And what you can do with this tool is go in and create an estimate. So let's look for Amazon EC2 again. It's a nice easy one to start with. We'll choose configure. I can choose my region. So for me, it might be Sydney. Just choose whichever region you want to run your workload in. You can choose your operating system. You can choose the amount of resources that you want to assign to this instance and how many of them you want to run. There's quite a few different options here, and then it will just give you an estimate at the bottom. So that's another really good tool that you can look into, and you can add different services as well. So if your application is going to use lots of different AWS services, you can add them all in and get an estimate of what it's going to cost you per month.